Normally when we catch up with Shelley Hansen, it's in relation to her beautiful poetry. Well, today, something a little bit different because Shelley has put out a book. Good morning to you, Shelley.
Good morning, Rick, and good morning, listeners.
The name of the book?
It's titled Sonnets from the She-Oaks, and it's an Australian novel.
Can you give us an overview, Shelley?
It's my debut novel, Rick, set in Australia, as I mentioned. It's a dual timeline story in 3 parts. Parts 1 and 3 take place in 2009 and 2010, around the time of the global financial crisis, which we all remember well. And Part 2 is set between the years of 1935 and 1946. The story begins with Jennifer Sanderson, recently retired, who is presented with a business opportunity in an idyllic location on the central coast of New South Wales. Little does she realise how a series of opportune encounters will change the lives of herself and her loved ones. The chance discovery of a book of poems unlocks a story of young love set against the backdrop of Australia in wartime, the aftermath of which will link 3 generations in a tale of resilience through adversity.
Shelley, you're talking about one of the main characters, if not the main character, Jennifer. Is that in any way autobiographical?
Well, I guess she probably is to some extent, Rick. When I began writing the novel back in 2014, I myself was recently retired. My family situation is quite different from Jennifer's, but like her, I play the piano. Her favourite music is also mine. Jennifer has a special fondness for the classical music of Chopin and also for the music of Charlie Chaplin. And I do too. I suppose to some extent I've borrowed from aspects of my own philosophy and my personality for Jennifer. But of course, although no character in the book is real, I think most authors draw from characteristics they've observed in people over the years to round out the various types of personalities that we're portraying.
And of course your love of poetry comes through because you've intertwined poetry into the novel.
Yes, well, as you know, I've written poetry all my life, and in more recent years, particularly since my retirement, I've pursued that endeavour more fully. I've been fortunate enough to win a number of awards for my poetry, and that's led to being featured on your morning show on ABC Local Radio for quite a number of years now. I've always had a soft spot for sonnets. They're just short poems, but in 14 lines they say so much. And so this was a great opportunity to create a character who wrote sonnets, because it gave me the chance to write those sonnets on her behalf and to include them in the book.
ABC Wide Bay, speaking to Shelley Hansen, part of our Authors Talk. Shelley, in the book there's some important topics, and one of those is polio and the treatments of Sister Kenny. They feature prominently in the book. What's the connection do you have to that?
Poliomyelitis, or infantile paralysis, was a real scourge right across the world in the days before vaccines were developed. My husband's uncle contracted polio shortly after the Second World War, and he remained disabled for the rest of his life. And during the 1930s, there was an epidemic of polio in Australia, and this is the one I deal with in my book. I've always been fascinated by the story of Elizabeth Kenny, the Queensland nurse who challenged the accepted methods of the day for dealing with polio. Instead of keeping patients immobile, she advocated heat and movement therapy to minimise atrophy in the limbs, and that actually became the forerunner of our modern physiotherapy. But in her day, the medical establishment fought against Sister Kenny's methods, and actually opinion is still divided. Whatever your personal view, you do have to admire her resilience and commitment to finding a way to lessen the suffering caused by this dreadful virus. I actually wrote a poem about Sister Kenny some years ago, and I called it Courage of Conviction, and I think that sums her up.
Shelley, other points of the book include the Second World War and how people were affected. A fascinating insight there. A word that comes up, one of my favourite words actually, it's serendipity. What can you tell us about the prominence of that word?
It's a great word, isn't it? Serendipity is a combination of events which have come together by chance to produce a happy outcome. And I guess in some ways it's the theme of my book. You know, my own life is the product of serendipity. At the age of 19, my German great-grandmother boarded a ship that she believed was destined for America. But an administrative error had her placed on the wrong ship, headed for Australia. My great-grandmother couldn't read or write, and so she was unaware of the difference. Well, on that ship, she met the man she would marry, and they spent their lives in the Maryborough region here in Queensland. So you see, Rick, it's not far-fetched to say that my birth was the direct result of serendipity.
Now, Shelley, for a lot of our listeners, they would have heard the name Shelley Hansen with the great poetry over many, many years. Now, let's talk about the poetry as compared to writing novels. Firstly, which is the hardest and which one did you enjoy the most?
Surprisingly, they are quite similar, at least with the kind of poetry I normally write, and I enjoyed them both, I would say, equally. As you know, my poetry heartland is traditional Australian rhyming verse, and I have a special interest in history, especially those lesser-known tales of our past. So when I write non-fiction poetry, a good deal of research is often involved. I've ventured into short story writing in the past, but I've long wanted to tackle a novel, and I'm drawn to fiction set against a historical background. When it comes to the actual exercise of writing, whether it's poetry, short stories or something longer, the process is the same, just one word after the next. You know, some people might think that the ideas miraculously morph into words on the page, but I'm afraid for me there are no shortcuts.
Now, a lot of people listening would be thinking, well, Shelley, this is her first book. Maybe they might get inspired to write a book as well. How much research, how much back-breaking work, sitting down, putting it all together from day one to day two, how many years or days were involved with that?
Well, like I said, I started it in 2014. It hasn't been a continuous process. I've picked it up and put it down and gone through periods of writer's block where I've had no idea where it's going from here. There's been a lot of research involved, particularly with the events of the war years. I actually found research to be one of the most enjoyable aspects of my writing. Of course, I wanted my account of the war years in Australia to be accurate and authentic, so I've featured real events. I also needed to research the social history of the era to add the appropriate mood and colour to the story. And it was important to get the timelines correct, not just with the big war events, but also the progression of rationing, weather events and so on, to give some realism as a background to the story. So the internet became my friend. I found the digitised newspapers on the Australian Government's Trove website to be one of the best resources, because that helped me to quote actual news sources and make sure my dates were right. So anybody who's looking at writing something with that is set in a historical background, that's very valuable.
You've done the book, you're reflecting. Is there other books in the pipeline for you, Shelley?
Well, it's taken me 8 years to do this one, Rick, so at the moment, no. A few people have asked me that. What's happening next in your story, or are we getting a sequel? Look, let's never say never, but at this stage I'm just going to sit back and hope that I can market the book, get it out there so that hopefully I'll get some readers to enjoy it.